Hey everybody. So it's been a while since I did any sort of tour of my home lab slash data center slash whatever this loud monstrosity in my basement is. So yeah, I figured, this was a good time. I've put some new servers in that I'm working on configuring and share with you, everything that I've got in my lab today and how it's looking. Alright, so if I back up a bit here, you can see the entire rack in the room in all of its glory. So from the left all the way over, sweeping over to the right there. And there's some junk that I'm not going to show you any more of. So at the front here, we have our air conditioner. In the summer it's running pretty much 24/7, and in the winter it runs pretty much not at all. It's set at 26 Celsius to try to keep the room relatively cool. I mean, it's still very hot in here and I sweat just standing in here. But I'm putting out somewhere in the order of 2,000 to 2,200 watts of pure heat all the time. So this is absolutely required. To bump the efficiency a bit, there's both an intake bit hacked together and an outlet out to the outside world. So ideally it's just taking hot air from outside, exhausting the heat into it, and then pumping it back out. Not as efficient as I would have liked with like a proper unit, but it's all I can do right now. It's plugged into the wall here, and I'll get to this later, but there's an Ethernet cable that comes out of there for power monitoring. So if I go down on the rack here at the very bottom, we have my two UPSs. They're connected over here to a single 20 amp circuit. So between the two of them I can't exceed 18 amps basically, but I rarely do. The rack's pretty comfortable under that limit, and the two UPSs give me a bit of an AB feed across the entire system, just in case, I need it. One of my, power supplies dies or something like that. Eventually, when I redo my house panel, that will actually be a full-blown circuit, or two circuits, one for each UPS. Right above that are two really old Dell servers that I don't care about. They're garbage. I bought them for a project and regretted the like 50 bucks I paid for them. Above that are three HP DL360 G6s. These I'm just put in today. I'm using them as testing hypervisors for PVC to test some of the more, let's say, cumbersome things to test in my main cluster, like fencing. I don't want to take down all my stuff all the time. So above that is my GPU transcode server. It doesn't do a whole lot except transcode movies with a nice GPU. It's basically there to let me have a target for RFFmpeg and Jellyfin to, better transcode my movies. So above that we have the main hypervisor cluster. Today it's a mismatch. At the top we have another HP DL360 G6, and then below that are two Dell R430. These I got recently, and I'm hoping to get a third one at some point in the future, but for now I just have to deal with the slight mismatch. So these run my PVC hypervisor and run all my production VMs. I've got somewhere in the order of 80 to 85 VMs right now that run across those three servers, and with the hypervisor manager it keeps them in sync, keeps if one of them were to fail or restart unexpectedly, it would bring them back up on the other host. It's a fully managed solution that lets me take full advantage of three hosts. Above that is my bulk storage. So I didn't mention the hypervisors, but there's actually SSDs for the VM disks. And then these servers run Ceph and give me all of my bulk storage for large files like media. So there's three of them in a Ceph cluster. Basically each server has a number of spinning disks in it, and it pools them all together, and then when data is stored on it, it stores a certain number of copies spread across the servers. For most of my stuff it's 2 copies, so it might store it on these two, or on these two, or on those two, and either way, if one server is down, I still have access to all of my data. So inside here, inside each of them, there's a 10 terabyte drive, 3 8 terabyte drives, 3 3 terabyte drives, and then a blank place for future drives. So right now I'm sitting pretty at about 118 terabytes of raw space. Usable, it's roughly half that. And it's not full yet, so I got plenty of growth to go. And plenty of room to grow. I can keep replacing 3 terabyte drives with 8 terabyte drives and fill in that last bay if I want. So above that are my routers. Yes, these are my routers. I have 2 of them, and yes, they are HP DL360 G6s because I'm a crazy person. They're in a active backup configuration with each other, so if one of them were to fail, the other one will take over. And they're running with a reduced configuration. They've only got like 4 gigs of RAM in them, and the CPU is turned way down, so it doesn't use as much power as you might think. Still more than I might like, but what are you gonna do? It was free. I mean, I had the hardware already. So if we go above that, we get into my switches. So the bottom switch is a 10 gig SFP plus switch. So every server here, the Ceph nodes, the main hypervisors, and the transcode server all connect to this 10 gig switch. That lets them, you know, transfer data between each other at an extremely high speed. Especially for Ceph and PBC, which uses Ceph, you want a very high speed data transfer because that's going to be your limitation in disk performance. So there's dual 10 gig to every server, and that helps keep things moving along quite swimmingly. On the other side of the switch here, there's 4 1 gig uplinks to the second switch, as well as a management uplink to the second switch. Well, I guess first switch, but who's counting? 10 gigs better. So the first switch is my 1 gig switch, 48 ports, and it does the bulk of the rest of my network besides the servers here. So it's all color coordinated. The oranges are my incoming WAN connections, so I have 2 ISPs. Each one comes out on a different port. The 4 white ones are the main, all the VLANs that are on the 10 gig switch that go into the router go through those 1 gig ports there. And then the rest of these yellow ports are all various management. We have, you know, the routers, the router management, and then everything else is either like an IPMI BMC to one of the various servers, or is just another device that lives on my network on that management network. The green ones here are wireless access points. So for my main home network, I have 2 Unifi UAP AC Pros. One upstairs and one downstairs, so that covers after probably about 10 years of fighting my house and trying to get Wi-Fi in everywhere that I stand. I finally did it with 2 UAP AC Pros, and they work fantastically. The third one goes to a UAP-LR, which I use for home automation devices. So anything that talks to my home automation system goes on this access point, and it's completely isolated from the rest of my networks. These red connections here go to the testing hypervisors. They used to go to desk phones, but I gave up on that idea a long time ago, so now they're being repurposed. These blue ones go to client networks in my house. Neither of them is actually connected because at this point everything is wireless, but they're there just in case I use them again. This yellow one goes to something I hooked up. It's in the management network and I forget what it is. And this goes over to my desk for, you know, other purposes. The last connections here, these are all 1 gigs that go to the primary hypervisors down here. So the purpose of them is if this switch were to ever go offline, at least they can still talk to each other. And then of course you got the uplinks here. So that's the front of my server rack, so I'll give it one more top to bottom just for the fun of it. Whee! So there's quite a lot going on here. On the side, we have a door, and we have a wall of fans that's basically just moving hot air out of the rack and into the room. You may notice temperature sensor, and maybe if you saw them up here, there's one there, there's one on the outlet. They're just monitoring the temperature of the room and the various points in it to kind of give me an idea of what the temperatures are like in here when I'm not in the room. I mean, to me it just feels sweltering, but it gives me a more accurate reading. So, opening up the rack, this is the most ghetto latch I've, ever had. I'll fix that eventually. And then my little rig to hook this up. I have a SATA cable that I plug, quote unquote, in there and wedge it in, and that holds my door open, otherwise it falls on me. So here's the back of the fan wall. Power supply running the fan wall. You know, not too exciting. So as I go in the rack, I'll turn on the light for it. So you can kind of see here what I call the sweep, which is all the connections that go to the patch panel and the 10 gig lines. They all come down, they go over this bar that's padded for my head's convenience. The client networks and the WANs go out the back. Well, the red used to be client, it's not now, but I'm not redoing this. And then the management and routers come down, the servers come down, all sweeps down, and distributes out to the various devices. So up here, back of the servers, and then this is an 8 terabyte hard drive, whose purpose is just to hold backups. In case the Ceph cluster were to blow up, I at least have another backup source, and I can, you know, get the data and run. We got the routers. As I mentioned, these are the like public connection, or the like DMZ is the wrong word, but like the server connections to the router, and this is the management network connection to the router, since it's the router for that too. A CARP connection, and then the management ports. The Ceph servers, you know, dual power, of course, dual power to pretty much everything that can take it. We got, you know, 10 gig, 1 gig management. Same story with the hypervisors. Dual power, dual 10 gig management, and that extra 1 gig I mentioned. GPU server, same idea. And there's my shiny GPU. It's a 1660 maybe Ti. The packaging was vague. And then my testing servers that only have the single 1 gig connection for now, because they're just for testing. Moving on in the back here, this is my server I call base. And calling it a server is a bit of a misnomer. I like to think of it as my desktop in a cloud. So I'm entirely mobile in my house. I only have a laptop, I don't have a desktop anywhere. So this machine basically gives me the flexibility of a desktop without sitting on a desk anywhere. Doesn't have a monitor plugged into it, despite that HDMI to VGA adapter hanging out of it. It's just a network port, and basically it's a headless Debian box that I SSH into, I run tmux on, and it just stays there running when I disconnect my laptop. The backup drive's plugged into it, so it holds my nightly backups and such. And in a lot of ways, this is both the least important and most important server in the rack. I mean, without it, managing all of this is a gigantic pain in the butt, and I can't do things like collect logs for a couple days straight. I'd have to shut my laptop. So it's incredibly convenient. The board itself is a Latte Panda Alpha. I have some distinct thoughts on it. When I got it, the one I got was defective and wouldn't boot, and I ended up having to pay about $120 to ship it back to Shanghai for them to just say, oh yeah, the thing's screwed, and send me a new one, which took an already expensive board and put it way over what my budget was, which, I mean, if I had bought it from somewhere other than them directly, I'd leave them a bad review for that nonsense. So be warned if you want to buy one. It's a great machine, but if it's defective, you're going to be paying through the nose to get it replaced. Beside that, we have a Raspberry Pi 4, and this is what Raspberry Pi 3, and this is probably the most important thing for the hardware of this rack. This is called ENV for environment, and it's basically monitoring everything about this rack. So plugged into it, we have numerous, connections through this breadboard that go out these. It looks like Ethernet that's stapled to the wall. Don't worry, it's not. I'm just using that for the temperature sensors. So I pointed out the 4 that were in the room. There's another one there, and there's another one down there. So that's collecting the data from all those temperature sensors for monitoring purposes. It's also got connected to it via these weird orange USB cables. Those are the 2 UPSs, so it's monitoring those over USB. And finally, it has another USB connection out to probably the coolest thing to me in my rack, which is this monstrosity. So I'll get you a better view along the side here. And down. And down. So this is a self-built 24-port monitored power distribution unit. So all these wires at the top here, each one of these goes to a Hall effect current sensor that's behind these center blocks here and is connected in series with the hot line of these plugs. So there's the two circuits, you know, side A, side B. Each one goes to the different UPS. And basically what this whole setup allows me to do is get instantaneous, within about, 30 seconds, power readings from every one of these outlets. The way it works, the Hall effect current sensor, as I said, the hot line goes into it. It goes through this little chip that detects the current, and it goes out the other side. They are safe. I've been running this for this or the previous version. This is 2.0 for about 3 years, and it's been totally fine. So it's reading that current, and what it's doing is it's giving you an analog voltage value out of it. It's centered on half of the input voltage of the chips, which is 5 volts. So at if you get 2.5 volts out, you're reading no current. If you get, say, I don't know, 4 volts out, that's reading something like 11 amps. They're 20 amp sensors. So the idea being you can take, using this Arduino here, the instantaneous readings of this, something like 600 times a second, divide that by 60, because 60 hertz cycle, I'm getting, about 10 poles in the sine wave cycle from up to down. And that basically lets me get, over the course of, say, 30 of these pole readings, a fairly good idea of how much current I'm using at the peak of the AC cycle and at the bottom of the AC cycle. And I can kind of normalize those together, do root mean squared calculations and some other finagling on it to basically get out a raw amperage value for every port. Compared to a kilowatt, it's actually pretty damn close. For anything that's reactive load, so any of these power supplies, it's actually very close to what the kilowatt says, probably within about 10 watts, which I consider my margin of error. For other things, like these really low powered things like the Raspberry Pi, it actually tends to be a little high, but I mean, I don't care. It achieves the goal of basically telling me how much power I'm using, relatively speaking. Like this is a very minor component of the total power. It's these things that are using all the power, so I don't really care about the slight variations there. So this is all monitored about every minute, and I'm collecting graphs out of that, so that gives me a very good idea of all my temperatures, my power usage, including the air conditioner, and I can graph it all and look at trends long term and basically see how the whole rack's performing. So yeah, that was my rack tour. Shut off the light, close her back up. If you have any questions, I'd be very interested in hearing them, and remember, it's high voltage, no trespassing.